Okay, welcome everyone to the fourth and final lecture of this series about the hierarchy of compassion worldwide of all times. And tonight we will discuss the spiritual impulses that came before the enormous impulse that this hierarchy of compassion gave the world through H.P. Blavatsky in 1875. And we will show that these impulses in fact continue non-stop. They are the pulses of the spiritual heartbeat that continuously provides humanity with inspiration of wisdom and compassion worldwide and at all times. Now this evening we will begin by discussing the common origin of these spiritual impulses. What is the underlying source? And this has of course already been discussed at length in previous lectures, so we will mainly be repeating a number of thoughts from the last 3 weeks. We will then zoom in on the most recent spiritual impulses, and by recent we are talking about a period of a few thousand years ago, because this is a period for which we also have some historiography in terms of the outside world, although this offers limited insight compared to the esoteric sources on which Theosophy is based. We will also consider the timescale of human evolution and point out a number of important cycles that play a role in this. And Herman Vermeulen will take us on a journey through the spiritual impulses in the East, the second part, and I will conclude the third part with spiritual impulses in the West. Now we will mention many traditions and names, but our main concern is that they all teach the same universal principles, the same Theosophy or universal wisdom. And that is why we will start by clarifying these theosophical principles once again, because they always give us something to hold on to when it comes to assessing the value of the many teachings. Now, what are these universal principles? We also refer to them as the three propositions, as they have been stated in the proem of Blavatsky's Secret Doctrine. Now we have discussed them at each lecture, but I will show them here in their entirety in the original wording as they are included in the Secret Doctrine. Now the first proposition is the principle of boundlessness. It reads: an omnipresent, eternal, boundless and immutable principle on which all speculation is impossible, since it transcends the power of human conception and could only be dwarfed by any human expression or similitude. In short, one absolute reality which antecedes all manifested conditioned being. Now in previous lectures we have also described this as a boundless reality, of which each person can only form a limited perspective, but in which you can always delve infinitely deeper. Now this idea of a boundless principle is reflected in all traditions worldwide. The principle of boundlessness, infinity or eternal duration, also implies that there is never an absolute beginning or end. Everything is in a state of continuous development. There are only relative beginnings and endings, because everything appears and disappears cyclically. Life and death are like sleeping and waking. It is essentially boundless consciousness that is active and then goes back to a period of rest. Because everything is essentially a ray of that boundlessness, a monad that comes and goes. And that is what the second proposition of Theosophy is about. Again, quoting the Secret Doctrine: the eternity of the universe in toto as a boundless plane, periodically the playground of numberless universes incessantly manifesting and disappearing, called the manifesting stars and the sparks of eternity. Now when we refer to universes, stars or sparks of eternity manifesting themselves, we are not referring to something external, but to the life behind it, which is really again that concept of the monad, a ray of the infinite, a ray of the boundless. And every being, from atom to star, from human to planet, is in essence such a monad that in itself forms a collaboration with other monads, a universe unto itself, a microcosm in a macrocosm. Now, cyclicity is a fact of life. Think of day and night, life and death, sleeping and waking. And the idea of something divine from which we came and to which we will return can also be found in all traditions worldwide. Finally, the third proposition is the fundamental identity of all souls with the universal oversoul. The latter being itself an aspect of the unknown root, and the obligatory pilgrimage for every soul, the spark of the former, through the cycle of incarnation or necessity, in accordance with cyclic and karmic law during the whole term. Now, in the secret doctrine, this capitalized word soul also refers to the monad, the spark of eternity or ray of consciousness. Every manifestation of a monad is a collaboration with other monads, we already said. So the oversoul, for example, is a divine monad at the top of a universe, within whose field we as monads manifest ourselves, and in doing so collaborate with countless child monads that are the rays of consciousness working through our cells, atoms, etc. As above, so below. So there is a hierarchical cooperation of monads in which monads undergo their evolution or growth. But in essence, all those monads are fundamentally identical, fundamentally the same. Now, one conclusion from this is that we have all possibilities within us. And this idea is also found in traditions worldwide. Now, based on these principles, we have considered the theosophical concept of hierarchy in the previous lectures. A cooperation of consciousnesses led by a hierarch with a certain sphere of influence. Everything is therefore part of a hierarchy and is also a hierarchy in itself. And the tetractys, familiar to us from Pythagoras, a name we will come across again later, beautifully illustrates this. Each point is a monad that cooperates with other monads and that relate to each other hierarchically. And the idea of life within life, cycles within cycles, therefore also provides an interesting perspective on what cycles or time periods actually are. Herman will tell more about that in the following part. Now, finally, a few important characteristics by which you can recognize a teacher from the hierarchy of compassion, before we will give examples of these teachers in the time before Blavatsky's arrival. Firstly, the teacher works for compassion and through compassion. He will therefore work always pro bono, free of charge. He never will ask for money. He works from the idea of unity and universal brotherhood. And he will always appeal to the inner divinity of human beings, and will therefore never make others dependent or exercise power over them. He works only with volunteers, people who, out of compassion and of their own free will, offer to become his co-workers and to make use of his wisdom. He will never present himself as the source or creator of the wisdom he imparts, but will always refer to Theosophia as the source, which he has also received from higher, more advanced realms of consciousness. Even if he sometimes refers to this metaphorically, think for example of Jesus speaking of the Father in heaven. Now, in the teachings of a teacher from the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion, you can always recognize the three propositions: the principle of boundlessness or infinity, the idea of cyclicity, and the infinite inner potential in human beings to develop wisdom in the light of responsibility or compassion for life as a whole. Now, if you keep this in mind, you can delve into the history of the countless traditions worldwide and recognize the true teachers in them. And we will do some of this together during this lecture and study. Now, right now, Herman will now discuss the spiritual impulses before Blavatsky in the East. And before that, he will also tell us a little more about cycles and impulses and cycles within cycles.
I will give attention to the pulses of the Lords of Compassion and Wisdom at the East. And of course, nowadays we all have some knowledge about it, but it is, I think, very instructive, very useful to give a little bit of attention to these different pulses.
Herman,
yeah?
we see all your slides at the side. Yeah, now it's okay.
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, thanks. Okay, one of the concepts what is always from the beginning understand in the East much better, maybe I should say easier, is the concept what Erwin already shows in the three fundamental principles, that idea of life within life. In the West we have quite often the idea that there is life, there is consciousness, and there is matter. But from the Theosophical principles, there is no absolute differences. Everything is life, everything has heavy consciousness, but not on the same level of expression, the same level of evolution. So one of the main consequences from this point of view is that all the cycles we speak in all the traditions, the Eastern traditions, and also in the Western traditions, and also in the secret doctrine, are in fact cycles of living, of consciousness, of living beings. So there is no something like a clock what is ticking and telling, okay, now it is time for the next phase and so on. It is all life within life. And giving you the example, we as living beings are, let's say, the time scale, the cycle for all the smaller consciousness like cells, atoms, molecules, organs, and so on, we cooperate with. We dictate for them the total time duration. Yeah. If you look in the literature, and especially in the East one, you will see that that is expressed in what they called manvantras and kalpas. So what you will see, through all that many periods, Theosophy is known as the, now I have to get rid of this thing, as the secret doctrine, representing the internal same source over which all wisdom has flowed and which continue to flow. So that means that in all that cyclic period, the same basic teachings were presented. According, of course, to some, according to some, let's say, cultural traditions, habits, and so on, but the essence, in principle, it is all the same. So, and what we have to take into account is that periods, that life periods, are periods of higher consciousness. It is life within life. So we as a human being, we are taking part in a bigger cycle of an, let's say, a higher being, and we have there taking our life and all that evolutionary cycles in it. Yeah, it is all in big cooperation with each other, because that higher consciousness need us to express themselves, and we need that higher consciousness to have phases, periods, and locations to work, to be incarnated, and giving the opportunity for building up, let's say, our experience. Bhagavad Gita, chapter 4, verses 6 and 8, give always a very, let's say, direct and very nice expression of it. Krishna explaining to Arjuna that he always is there and that he always comes when there is a need for it. Yeah. The time periods expressed in kalpas of mahamavantras, big periods of time. We're speaking about 4,320 millions of years. Yeah. But the main clue in the word manvantara is in fact giving the idea that it is in between two manus, and saying that it is in fact a period of a living being. Yeah. And manu in this case is not only one being, but it is a higher being in cooperation with all the underlying beings what are needed. So from this point of view, and also the three fundamental principles, you have the very strong idea that there is no manifestation from one single consciousness. It is always cooperation in hierarchical structure, let's say, run by a higher inspiration, a higher consciousness, what give, let's say, location, energy to the other, to the lower one, so they can build up their experience as well. And that is a very different concept what you can find easily in the West, in the Buddhist traditions, in the Hindu traditions, in a lot of other Eastern traditions, and what we in the West have much more difficulty to, let's say, to understand this. The East is always having this information. Yeah. What we have to keep in mind that time periods is not just one, but each period is built based on smaller, large and smaller cycles. So it is cycle within cycle, like the 24 hours of our day, the cycle of the week, the month, the year, and let's say the many years what we can call for a human being, our lifetime. Yeah. In that whole cyclic information and the knowledge based on cycles, there is a very well-known period, what is called the Messian cycle, 2160 years. And that cycle is always, how you can say, a moment that a teacher appears, bring the message, what will run for that 2160 years, and so on and so on. Yeah. Keep in mind that it is possible that on the world there are running different cycles in parallel. Cycles for the East, cycles for the West. Has all to do with, let's say, different type of consciousness, different type of cultures, and so on. The Theosophia, secret doctrine, the eternal source, is what is always coming and going. Yeah? The Theosophia, from which subcurrents, the later religions and philosophical systems have emerged. And I just give a very small number, and I'm focused a little bit more on the East, but that is the coming of the Buddha. Yeah? The Buddha based his activity on the Hindu cycle, what was before. Yeah, he was coming to restore that information. Yeah, another example in the East, a very particular one, is the one of Lao Tse. Yeah, very well known by his famous small booklet called The Tao of the King. And then, of course, we have in the West people like Pythagoras, the Neoplatonic people, the Gnostics, and so on. And you see certain persons start cycles, and certain messages are closing cycles, rounding off. Yeah, coming back, regroup, make, let's say, summary, refresh ideas, what are running out in that particular cycle, and present it in that way. And in that case, I'm particularly thinking about the Neoplatonic people and the Gnostics. One thing what makes understanding of the universal ideas, the Theosophia, the knowledge, a little bit more, let's say, challenging, is the fact that all that messages, the Buddha and so on, but also Blavatsky, they have to bring a knowledge what is much more and much deeper than, let's say, the culture, the time period, they present this knowledge. So all that teachers have the same challenge to give something what is very deep and very esoteric and very hard to understand for people hearing this for the first time, yeah, in a way so that it can take up step by step and we can study it and we can learn it, yeah. And that is what we called with the English word Adumbration. So they bring it out in a sketchy-like information, yeah. The basic idea, yeah, and the basic idea, they have all elements of truth in it, but not too much detail, just looking to the big outline and present it, yeah, giving that outline, most important facts and so on, yeah. It is a type of fake sketch what they give, an imperfect image, and then gradually you will see that I start to explore and giving more information so that I will bring that information in a more full presentation. Something what I think will be much clearer in the next series of lectures what starts the next Sunday, yeah, when we're speaking about Blavatsky coming 1875 and during her lifetime till 1891, she is giving teachings on teachings and they become more, let's say, deeper, more spiritual, and so on and so on. Because there was a growing understanding, and that is what they need, yeah? So the teachings are what you can call super spiritual level. And it is the same, more or less the same technique what we do in our schools, in education. In the first class, you don't bring the same information what you will be do on the end of that particular school, yeah? So you start in the first class, very simple, very basic principles, try to explain them, and take your children or pupils, how you want to call it, with you and bring them step by step, let's say, aware of the much deeper meaning of it. One of the things you will easily see, and certainly in the West as well, yeah, but also in the East, that in the course of the message, that let's say 2160 years, yeah, there is all translation, writing down, comments, and so on. If you look in the Eastern traditions like Buddhism and so on, you can say the teachings of the Buddha, he presents them, his arats, his chelas, were writing it down. On that writing down, they start to give additional information in the style of comments, yeah. But also you will find people who start to study certain aspects of the teachings of the Buddha, and that will be known as certain parts of it. I just called a name like Nagarjuna or the Yogacarya schools. They work out Buddhism on different level. But the challenge, even nowadays, also what we have with Buddhism and also with translations from the Tao Te Ching of Lao Tse and so on, is that no language is the same. Translators often giving interpretation of particular texts. And what you can see is translations on translations. Special if you look in the Eastern traditions, you see quite often that the teachings of the Buddhas, they were used in India, then they were, let's say, in a number of attempts spread out to the north of India, Tibet, and China, Japan, Korea, and so on. There, in the Tibet and in China and so on, they start to translate the text. Later on, there was a second attempt to spread Buddhism in it, new translations, new comments, and so on. And it happens in the Buddhist literature that the original Sanskrit source was lost. They go to the Chinese text and start to translate the Chinese text back to the Sanskrit. And it happens that some translators make note and say, sorry, but translating this from China back to Sanskrit, I really noticed that parts are missing. So you see the old challenge by doing this translation and spreading the teachings. There is a huge challenge, a huge obstacle to keep the teachings pure and keep them alive. And then, of course, what you can see easily in a lot of traditions, that over the time, the meaning of a word is changing. Yeah. If you look, for instance, I have a Chinese dictionary, what is special, let's say, coming from the time of Lao Tse, that is about 600 years before Christ. And then you can see in the dictionary a complete list of changing that meaning of that particular Chinese character over the last 2000 years. And that is quite something. That is really quite something. What I try to show here is just an example how it was going in the situation of Gautama the Buddha. After, let's say, Gautama the Buddha was dying and was going into Nirvana, 100 years after that, we get all type of councils what present different traditions within Buddhism already there. Yeah. So we speak about only 100 years after the Buddha. There are already different schools. The Mahasankhya, for instance, is one, splitting out in two traditions we still have nowadays, like the Hinayana on one side and the Buddhayana on the other side. Buddhayana later on become known as Mahayana. And Mahayana is splitting out in the Madhyamika and the Yogacarya school. Madhyamika, Nagarjuna, that type of people. Yogacarya, the two brothers, what spread the Theosophy. They spread the Buddhism in a certain, let's say, flavor. And quite often you have discussions and they say, oh, no, this is the right one, that is the right one. But in principle, it can easily understand that, in fact, you have to study the two different flavors because they are coming from one source. You have to study that flavors to see and to have a better picture of the original sources. Yeah, and you see on the right one, you see there a lot of titles from different literature, the Prajna Paramitas, the Sandra Pundrika, the Prajna Paramitas, the Lankavatara Sutta, the Diamond Sutra, that are all, let's say, old documents still nowadays available, also in our Western language, English and so on. But please keep in mind, these are translations. So there's always the challenge, what happens with that. But okay, if you make a wide study and you take some time to do a good study, then you are still able to find a deeper meaning on it. Theosophy is really helping us absolute quite a lot to understand these documents in the right meaning. What you will see is the succession of teachers. If you look over the periods, and Erwin later on will give also a number of names, that all that teachers are coming as a type of succession. They bring every time on that cyclic moment, call it a new impulse, yeah, bringing the Theosophia, you can say, refreshed, yeah, try to overcome what was happened in the last 2000 years, give it again, try to give the principles again, like Blavatsky was doing, and give you, let's say, the opportunity to go back to and come close to the original source. Yeah. One of the things, and we mentioned it already a little bit, if you have to deal with that, and you ask yourself, what is the value? Is it a teaching coming from the Lords of Wisdom or not? That big, let's say, key, the big thing you have at hand is that you know they're coming from the same organization, the Lords of Wisdom and Compassion. They give in principle the same message, the same teachings, so there can never be a conflict by, let's say, one teacher and the other. And give you also the nice opportunity. For instance, take the 3 fundamental principles of the secret doctrine. You should be able to find them back in all that particular traditions. Maybe in different words, maybe a little bit different presented, but in essence, they should be absolutely the same. A very nice example, what I like very much. If you take, for instance, the Tao Te Ching, and you take the first paradox, the Tao Te Ching consists of 81 paradoxes. The first paradox, you will find so many elements in the first paradox, what you can find in the 3 fundamental principles, as an example. But there is ook one line, what you can find back by Nagarjuna, when he starts speaking about Sunyata, will be an article in our magazine Lucifer, yeah, Sunyata, and Lao Tse put it in one line in 10 Chinese characters and say, in my words, the more you desire it, the less you see it. And that is exactly the clue for the idea of Sunyata. So what do the teachers? They refresh what was presented already, restoring what was lost, yeah? In this example, Gautama the Buddha restored the decay of Hinduism, yeah? Give all the teachings back to the people in the street, the common people, because Hinduism starts to become a type of a group of elites, yeah? Recovered that activity, teachings, and that is what we now called Buddhism. In the time of the Buddha, it was not called Buddhism, it was called wisdom, yeah? We see the same with Jesus the Nazarene in the New Testament. We find a lot of, let's say, fundamental principles back in the New Testament. And one example I give here is the one, the Tao Te Ching was presented, let's say, 600 years before our period. And in 200 in our period, there was a guy, Wang Pi. Tao Te Ching was original draw on bamboo pieces, hold together with small ropes. Over the years, the ropes were broken, pieces of bamboo were missing. So let's say the context of the Tao Te Ching, the original sequence, was lost. Wang Pi was a young guy. He studied Chinese literature. He was 24 years. He starts to restore the Tao Te Ching. And when he was finished, he was dying. And he knew from the beginning that the only job he has to do and to prepare for was to restore the original sequence and characters of the Tao Te Ching. And his sequence is still what we use nowadays. Just as an example, that the Lords of Compassion and Wisdom is taking care of all the messages and the need of it. Yep. One of them very important element to share with you is the question is, why decay? What is the reason? Yeah. And one of the main reasons I put here on top is the anthropomorphic way of thinking. If we study, we have always a type of habit as human being, try to build pictures according the way we think it is. Okay, that is what we do. But we should realize by doing this, by studying something, that we build our own picture. And that we should realize that it is limited by the way we understand it. And that means that you have to study, to restudy, and so on, look in other sources, try to be more universal as you are, let's say, not in the normal daily life, but really try to be above, more universe than you are normally are. Because otherwise, you can easily understand that if we start to interpret it, the teachings according to the way I understand it, I pass it on in the way I understand it, the other person starts to study it, he passes it on in the way he understands it, and then you can easily see a race of decay, and it becomes less and less close to the original. What should you do? And that is what you can find easily in the East, is what they say, if you spread it, you should say, so I have heard. So that is, don't give an interpretation, but give it in the way you have received it. Yeah? So that is a very strong step, and you need really a very strong discipline for this. So, and that is also, this way of decay is one of the big needs that teachings have to come after a couple of thousand years to restore the original information. So, this was my attempt to show a little bit of the schools in the East. And I give Erwin the opportunity to go on.
Okay, so spiritual impulses in the West. I will mention quite a few, but briefly. And this is really to show that actually, if you look at all the impulses, they are really from front to back connected, and that there is actually hardly any time where there wasn't any spiritual impulse going on in this period of the world. Of course, Herman already told that there are several cycles that can be running parallel to each other. Now, which will I mention? We will mainly be looking at the past 3,000 years, so a little further back than the Messianic cycle. I will start with Pythagoras. I will explain in a moment why. Then we will discuss the impulse of Plato and the Neoplatonist. Then Jesus the Nazarene, the Islamic philosophy, the Renaissance, Rosicrucians, and the Reformation, the Age of Revolutions and the Freemasons, and then the last part of the 19th century, the last quarter, which is the prelude to the impulse of H.P. Blavatsky. Now, in this part, many names and concepts from traditions worldwide are discussed, but we use these names of teachers and teachings primarily as illustrations that they have the same origin, that they share the same source, the same Theosophia. So our aim is to demonstrate that all these spiritual impulses always put forward these universal principles, such as the three propositions that you can recognize, but then in other words, fitting to the time and culture. So we start with Pythagoras, and in doing so, we are starting out a bit with the East again, and are also including a little bit of ancient Egypt, because Pythagoras came originally from Asia Minor, and he is known for a couple of things. One of his famous quotations is that everything is number, which means that everything consists of vibrations, you could say, of movement, of self-movement, as Plato would say, or as Blavatsky in The Secret Doctrine writes, that motion is the only reality, that more or less everything is alive. Has a certain frequency, a certain number. Now, the monad is also an idea that you can find with Pythagoras. And just like the aforementioned tetractys, although he was not the inventor of the tetractys, Blavatsky writes, which is also based on these monads working together, cooperating in a hierarchy. He also assumed cyclicity, He taught, for instance, the idea of metempsychosis and the transmigration of the soul, an aspect of the doctrine of reincarnation. And he also taught the harmony of the spheres and gave meaning to the word philosophy, but then as wisdom of love, as explained last week. And he saw philosophy as gaining insight into the underlying forces that hold the universe together, and was even himself too modest to call himself a philosopher. And he's also famous for his golden verses, including 10 virtues that totally correspond to the 10 paramitas of Buddhism. And that's not by coincidence, because Pythagoras was mainly influenced by Eastern wisdom. He was initiated into the mysteries of Orpheus, who, as Blavatsky points out, actually came from India. And Pythagoras also studied in Egypt for 22 years and was eventually also initiated into the mysteries of the Temple of Thebes. And because he gained a certain level of knowledge through that initiations, the Eastern sages that he met even had the duty to share more of their knowledge with him. Now, he influenced, of course, Greek and Western philosophy. He influenced Plato, the Neoplatonists, Hermeticists such as Paracelsus, and also scientists such as Galileo, because Pythagoras already taught the heliocentric system, with the sun as the center of our solar system, and more scientific ideas, because we are probably all familiar also with the Pythagorean theorem, and that shows that science, philosophy, religion were really treated as one at that time. Now, that was also the case that wisdom was approached from all these three perspectives with the next great Greek sage, Plato. And he's known for, among others, the idea of homoiosis toi theoi, which means the unification with the inner deity, the inner divinity. It was also the call to action from Socrates that he wanted the outer man on earth and the inner man to merge, so to say, and that the outer man on earth reflected as much as possible the inner man, the inner divinity. Of course, Plato is very well known for his theory of the ideas, that there is an inner world of imperishable universal ideas that precede the outer world of phenomena, and with the idea of the good above all other ideas. And the good is the idea, you could say, from which ideas such as truth and beauty derive their truth, so to say. And the virtues of justice, wisdom, courage, self-control also stem from the idea of the good, which cannot be limited by any definition or description, and much of what Plato describes you can also recognize in the first proposition of the Secret Doctrine. Now, the philosopher king is also another core idea, and that true leaders must be forced to lead, because they will always claim that there is someone even better than them. And also the idea that universal justice or harmony comes before and stands above the human interpretation of the law. That compassion is central. You could see, for example, in the return to the cave in his well-known allegory. And Plato is also, of course, also known as the founder of his academy. Now, he was himself influenced by, of course, Socrates first, being his pupil, but he was also initiated into Egyptian and Pythagorean mysteries, and was influenced by Greek philosophers such as Heraclitus and Parmenides. And he himself, of course, influenced the Neoplatonists, but also the Stoics, the Roman Stoics, the Islamic philosophy, and later on the Renaissance and Western philosophy. Now, Plato clearly expresses theosophical core ideas such as the three propositions. He writes about reincarnation, and the principle of as above, so below. For example, as reflected in his statement that souls have the same principles and structure as the world soul. He also used many metaphors because as an initiate in the mysteries he could not directly express certain ideas and had to protect them in the form of metaphors or similes. But 5 to 6 centuries later, you see that the Neoplatonists express much more of his ideas, which the Neoplatonists themselves say are all based on Plato. Now, one of the main teachers from the Neoplatonists was Plotinus. He is mainly known for his ideas about the One, and he was able to be more outspoken about this idea than Plato was in his time. Also, the idea of emanation, the idea that everything flows from and can be traced back to the One, and the return to the One, that he taught a doctrine identical to that of the Vedanta, namely that the spirit soul emanates from the one divine principle and is reunited with it after its pilgrimage. Now, he was influenced by his teacher Ammonius Saccas, who never wrote anything, of whom Plotinus was a student, and was also influenced by Eastern philosophy and, of course, Plato. And he himself influenced the later Neoplatonists, the Islamic philosophy, and also Renaissance and Western philosophy. Now, in the Key to Theosophy, Blavatsky refers to the Neoplatonic school in Alexandria as a precursor of the Theosophists. They were also called Philaleteians, lovers of truth, but the word Theosophia also appeared in those days. And there's also a mention of a clear, what we call Guru Parampara, or succession of teachers. And this was already the case at Plato's academy in Athens, where Plato's nephew Speusippus was the first successor and then succeeded by many teachers after him. And the Alexandrian school was a kind of copy of Plato's school in Athens. And after the school of Alexandria, the Neoplatonists also rebuilt Plato's school in Athens after it had been destroyed a few centuries before. And some teachers and their students who succeeded one another in one of these schools, either Athens or Alexandria, were, of course, Ammonius Saccas, Plotinus, Porphyrius, Iamblichus, Hypatia, Proclus, and Damascius. All very famous names in philosophy. And Damascius was actually one of the last 7 philosophers of Plato's academy in Athens, who found refuge with the Persian emperor Khosrou when the academy was closed by the emperor Justinian. And this is an important fact because actually that meant that the Islamic world also began to play a role in the spread of these ideas. Now, to illustrate the Theosophia of that time, a quote from Plotinus. He wrote, "Our thinking cannot grasp the one as long as any other image remains active in the soul. Therefore, you must free your soul from all external matters and turn completely inward, with no inclination towards what lies outside, and rid your thinking of ideal forms as you did before of sensory objects, and even forget yourself, and thus come into the sight of the One." Now that's very similar to the phrase that Herman just quoted from Lao Tzu's Tao Te Ching about getting rid of your desires to understand, come to the Tao. Now we are already now in the first centuries of our era with discussing the Neoplatonists, but I've already discussed them because they are a direct continuation of Plato and the Greeks. But that was not chronological because we cannot, of course, ignore another huge impulse when we talk about the Messianic cycle, that of Jesus the Nazarene. He was, according to Theosophical teachings, an aphateric phenomenon. a temporary collaboration of different beings that enabled the transmission or incarnation of a divine being. Really a mystery of white magic, you could say. And to understand the concept of Avatara, you can also watch Herman's lecture on the subject from last season in the series Compassion, the Law of Laws, because it's a bit wide a topic to go into right now. Now, Jesus is known, amongst others, for the idea that the kingdom of God is within us, and to love your God above all else, and likewise love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this coming of Jesus meant a transformation from the Mosaic teaching of revenge, that of an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, from the Old Testament, and then transforming to the teaching of forgiveness in the New Testament. Now, Jesus was very much influenced by the Nazarenes and the Essenes, a Buddhist sect at that time in what now is Syria. And you can find, amongst others, a strong similarity with the Sermon of the Mount and the Buddhist sutra, the Pratimoksha Sutra. Now, Jesus influenced, of course, the Gnostics, later Gnostic teachers such as Clement of Alexandria and Origen, and also, of course, later the Rosicrucians, Freemasons, and also the Islam. Now, his impulse is still at work and still contains a core of wisdom, but unfortunately it has degenerated greatly. It deteriorated from wisdom to belief. Priests and churches emerged that began to exercise power over others. And the dogmatic Christianity has caused a great deal of violence if you look in history. Now, here you see the problem when religion becomes separated from philosophy and science. But it can also be different. For example, in Islam, during what they call the Golden Age, between the 8th and 13th century. Now, Islam began with Mohammed, of course, who came at a time when the Arabs were really a rough, undisciplined people with little sense of ethics. And the Arab tribes were constantly at war with each other, with a lot of violence. Now, one of Muhammad's most famous sayings was, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God. And this can be interpreted as a personal God outside of us, but on the other hand, it can also be seen as Muhammad's way of connecting to the people of that time. Because Allah can also be interpreted as the divine, the one, the all, the divine that is everywhere. Now, in the early days, Islam was also subject to philosophical inquiry. Philosophers asked also questions such as, what about Allah? What about God? Can a God have characteristics? If it is a universal, at the same time, if it is a sort of principle. Now, one of these philosophers was Avicenna, and Avicenna also came up with a proof of God, but it concerns much more this universal idea of the divine. Some of his statements that point to this are that the world is infinite and the necessity of existence in itself. Because his reasoning was that the origin, that Allah, the original God, the source of everything, must be something that is not contingent, meaning that it doesn't derive from something else. So it must necessarily be a thing that is not contingent and that therefore exists in itself. And this may seem like a bit wordplay, but there's a profound understanding behind it of something that you can also recognize in the formulation of the first proposition. Everything you say about it diminishes it, limits it. It is omnipresent, eternal, boundless, and it can only be expressed in negations. And Avicenna also taught, again, the doctrine of emanation. Now, the later sage Rumi from the school of Sufism or esoteric Islam also clearly taught about the divine in each being. For instance, illustrated by his quote, "I am the same as he." Now, in the golden age of Islam, true religion, philosophy, and science were not separate. Many philosophers were involved in both religion and sciences like mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. And Baghdad was a great center for these schools, and at the time it was very tolerant. Philosophy could even contradict the Quran, and unfortunately, this changed in later Islamic times, while Muhammad himself says that there is no compulsion in religion. Now, I've already mentioned that after the closure of Plato's academy, 7 philosophers, including Damascius, were given shelter at the court of the Persian Emperor Khosrow. And this is an important fact because it allowed the teachings of Plato and the Neoplatonists to enter the Persian and later Islamic world. And this in turn had a major impact in awakening Europe from the Dark Ages with the Renaissance. Now, initially 3 people are central to this impulse. The Byzantine Gemistos, who was very interested in Plato and therefore also called himself Platon. And at the age of 83, he was allowed to accompany the Byzantine emperor on a visit to Florence. And while he was there, he gave lectures on Platonism and Zoroastrianism, which were intended by many young people from Florence at the time. And one of his occasional students was Cosimo de' Medici, who was a banker's son from the rich and influential Medici family. And he was very impressed by Platon's enthusiasm for founding a Platonic academy in Florence. So in 1462, he founded the Platonic Academy himself in Florence. And he appointed Marsilio Ficino as its head. Now, Marsilio Ficino was the family doctor of the Medici family and was also an expert in ancient Greek. And Cosimo ensured that all the original works in Greek by Plato and the Neoplatonists were preserved and remained available thanks mainly to the Islamic world. And Cosimo bought all these works so Ficino could translate these works, all these works by Plato and Neoplatonists from the Greek into the Latin. Now we will return to the 4th name on this list, Pico della Mirandola, in a minute. Now furthermore, you see in this period of the late Middle Ages and the Reformation coming up, and also the rise of the Rosicrucians, all kinds of alchemists and Kabbalists. For instance, in the 13th century, the German Christian Rosenkranz had a vision of Christ. He was at that time a bit involved in what you could say black magic. And then he got a vision where he received a warning about his practices, a vision of Christ telling him about that, and after that made a vow and disappeared from this outer world, so to say. And subsequently, the Society of the Rosicrucians was added to the family of Kabbalists. Now, the Rosicrucians strove to unite the most diverse branches of occultism, and they quickly became famous for their extreme purity of their lives and their extraordinary powers, as well as for their profound knowledge. Now, Paracelsus, Jacob Boehme, also called Theosopher, and Thomas Vaughan are some of the most important figures who played a role in the spread of ancient wisdom through the societies of Rosicrucians, alchemists, and Kabbalists. Now, in addition, at that time, the Reformation arose, with which societies in Western Europe struggled to break free from the grip of the Catholic Church. The German Johann Reuchlin and his student Luther were a number of important figures, as were also Erasmus, Hugo Grotius and William of Orange in the Netherlands. Now, too many figures to discuss them all, but it's very interesting to look them all up in theosophical literature. And we will take a closer look at one of them as an illustration of the impulse of the Renaissance, Pico della Mirandola. Now, from a very young age, Pico already studied philosophy, but he also immersed himself in Islam and also Jewish teachings. And in 1484, he met Marsilio Ficino in Florence, who became his teacher. And he was only 24 years old when he published his 900 Theses. And in doing so, he attempted to bring Islam, Judaism, Christianity, and Platonism in line with one another. And his main goal was to reconcile the contradictions between the different traditions and to bring a universal truth to light. A number of these theses actually anticipated the Great Reformation. And as you can expect, the Church was not very happy with these theses, and despite Pico's defense, his theses were rejected and banned. Pico had to flee and died at the age of 31 under suspicious circumstances, probably by poisoning. Now, as an introduction of his 900 Theses, he wrote the Oration of the Dignity of Man, which is seen as a kind of Renaissance manifesto. And I would like to quote a few sentences from it. Now, he speaks to Adam, which could be seen as the archetypal man. Every human being, you could say. He says, "O Adam, you may, by your own free will, trace for yourself the lineaments of your own nature, and you may, as the free and proud shaper of your own being," which is actually a reference to Plotinus, "fashion yourself in the form you may prefer. It will be in your power to descend to the lower, brutish forms of life, but you will be able, through your own decision, to rise again to the superior orders whose life is divine. In short, it is our choice, with our faculty of thinking and our free will, to choose to either descend in the material realms or to become divine." I think this is really pure theosophy at the time of the Renaissance. Now, with the Renaissance and then the Reformation, a clear new wind began to blow in Western Europe. And this was fanned even further in the following century, in the 18th century, when a spirit of freedom of thought and conscience gained ground in Europe, which was mainly fueled by three individuals connected to the Theosophical movement at the time, who also foresaw the upheavals that it would cause. And then we talk about Saint-Germain, Cagliostro, and Mesmer, in the images shown from left to right. Now, much is shrouded in mystery about these three people, and many wild stories circulate. For instance, from the many reports, it is clear that they each had special gifts. It is said of Saint-Germain, for example, that he was fluent in numerous languages, including French, German, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, English, and was also familiar with Chinese, Latin, Arabic, and even ancient Greek and Sanskrit. He was highly musical, very intelligent, and socially skilled, and also traveled to all the courts of that time in Western Europe, from Paris to London and to The Hague. Not for his own amusement, but to do diplomatic work, to ensure that the upcoming revolutions in thinking that would also cause upheavals in society, as in France, that they would proceed as peacefully as possible. Now, Blavatsky called him certainly the greatest Oriental adept Europe has seen during the last centuries. But Europe knew him not, she writes. Now, Saint-Germain was also actually in charge of the impulse in the 18th century that was mainly channeled through the German physician and scientist Anton Mesmer. And Cagliostro also supported this impulse. And Mesmer was a healer through magnetism and stimulated scientific research into these invisible phenomena, thus bringing the average thinking into a more immaterial realm. Now, these three gentlemen were also connected to the rise of the Freemasons from the 7th century onwards. And the Freemasons movement was also one of the embodiments of Theosophy in the long chain of Hermes, and more or less following on from the impulse of the Rosicrucians, of whom Cagliostro was also a member. In the meantime, on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, another impulse was gaining momentum in the freedom of thought and the breaking away from the power of the church, namely the American independence. And their founding fathers and brave Freemasons like Washington, Jefferson, and Franklin were also inspired by the work and ideas of Thomas Paine. And Thomas Paine's statement, "My own mind is my own church," is already very telling. Now, thanks in part to Thomas Paine's ideas, the American Declaration of Independence was written without any reference to the Christian faith or to the Christian God, the dogmatic faith that had for centuries opposed the progress of human development. Instead, it refers to the natural rights of every human being, such as the right to life, the right to freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, we will now discuss the prelude to Blavatsky's impulse in 1875 in the first half of the 19th century. Now, in Europe, from the end of the 18th and the beginning of the 19th century, you see all kinds of Eastern influence coming in through France, with the attention to the focus on the Upanishads, Germany, where they started with the study of Sanskrit, and Max Müller also published later on the great books of the East, and England through the colonization of India, where there, of course, was a lot of cultural exchange with the ancient ideas there. And in the US, there was a strong influence through the study of Plato. And there was thanks in part to figures in the English-speaking world who brought Plato's ideas to life, such as Henry Moore and especially Thomas Taylor, who translated all of Plato's and the Neoplatonists' work into English. And his work was put to good use by, amongst others, the American Platonist Alexander Wilder, who helped Blavatsky a lot with Isis Unveiled, here seen in the photo on the left. And on the right, you see Ralph Waldo Emerson, the transcendentalist philosopher, who studied the translations from Thomas Taylor in his hometown of Concord with people like the famous writer and civil rights activist Henry Thoreau. Now, Emerson is known for his essay, The Oversoul, a term that was subsequently used in the Secret Doctrine to describe the third proposition, as we have already seen. And the characteristic sentence from that essay that reflects theosophical thought is the following: "Within man is the soul of the whole, the wise silence, the universal beauty, to which every part and particle is equally related, the eternal one." Now, we have now covered spiritual impulses in the West from the time of Pythagoras up to 1875. And hopefully in this short description you can see already as clearly as I do the unbroken line of inspiration that has existed from century to century, from teacher to teacher in the Western world. Now, I came across a lot in my preparatory studies. That's why I also mentioned so much, but I have left out much more than I have included. And so this overview is far from complete. It doesn't include ancient Egypt, North and South America, Africa, the Celts, Scandinavia, the Germanic peoples, Stoicism, Kabbalah, mythology, fairy tales, art. Think also of Shakespeare, for example, and well, many more. So nevertheless, I think we can already draw a number of important conclusions, even from this limited list, that all these spiritual impulses share a common source, the lodge of wisdom and compassion, that they have existed worldwide at all times, that they always build on each other, that they work for compassion through compassion, always without charge. This was, for instance, also the case with Saint Germain, who always offered his advice for free. With an appeal to the inner divinity of man, his own free will, and a reference to the secret doctrine, Theosophy, as a source, recognizable by the three propositions. And I think we can also conclude that the success of spiritual impulses depends on the cooperation of each and every one of us. Each of us can be an instrument to bring more compassion and wisdom into this world, sometimes simply by keeping, you could say, these teachings alive, translating them, spreading them, sending them into the world. So I sincerely hope that you will share these conclusions with us. And if you have any questions, then after a short break of 3 minutes, it's time to discuss them. And then we have time for 10-minute questions and then go into the study on Zoom. Okay, see you in a minute. All right, Jenny, have you received any questions before?
Yes, we have one question in the beginning of the lecture. It came already. That is, do you have a good definition for life? And so what is life? You were talking about life within life, Herman.
Yeah. Herman, you want to answer or?
Yeah, well, if I have to answer, I will use Plato, and that is something what you can do better than I. So, yeah.
Yes, Plato has a definition. Actually, we mentioned it shortly. In one word, he calls it self-motion or self-movement, and he describes it as the ability to act or react from to impulses coming from outside. So that's a very short definition, which is very universally applicable. So, and that's a definition that we always or many times refer to.
Yeah. The beauty of that definition is that wherever you look in, let's say, physics or whatever disciplines, you can see exactly that same process there. Yep.
I was also thinking about this symposium what we had in 2018, I think, about life wisdom. And then there was also a lecture about what is life. And I can put a link in the chat.
Yeah, good idea. Yeah.
That were the questions. No more other questions.
Great. And as you can already see, I haven't shared my screen, but as you know, if you want to join Zoom, please email to info@Blavatsky. I was a bit late to mention this, but maybe if you're very quick, then Jenny or one of our coworkers is so kind to give you access to the link, and then we close the YouTube broadcast and then continue via Zoom. Then I want to point out the next lecture, or actually the next series, but it's of course one lecture series, these 6 months or 5 on 18 million years of Theosophy and 150 years, or 18 million years of Theosophia, 150 years of Theosophy. Herman already said next week we're going to focus on the impulse of Blavatsky. So, but not about her as a person, but much more the role she played as, well, you could say the outer head. She was the outer head of the work, the impulse of the hierarchy of compassion. And Joanna Vermeulen will present these series and also show how what she did really connected to well the work of the hierarchy as part of this living planet, and also show you how the whole life period of Blavatsky is more or less following a sort of universal pattern, comparing it to the work of the Buddha. So I think very interesting. So we hope to see you all next week. And then I thank you all for your contributions. And then we end like we always do with Gayatri from the Rig Veda. So, O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.